Weather on for you, and we're looking for you to turn the lights on for us.
G'day. Looking at some of the lingo now, I've been here for a few days. Yeah, so my name's Zion, and I have a long history of climate activism. I've been involved in these groups since I was very, very young, and started out with just being concerned about the environment and trying to get my parents to recycle and little things like that, and then got involved with groups like Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace. You know, I had good intentions, like many environmentalists. I cared about the planet, and I was learning about global warming at school, and I just wanted to try and do good in the world. But when you go into these groups, they have very set ideas, and when you're young and you go in, you know, there's not really a way of questioning those ideas. So one of the things that I have changed my position on, which many of you know, is nuclear energy. If you are in these groups, traditionally you are anti-nuclear, and so I was told, you know, a lot of misinformation about nuclear. I was told that millions of people died at Fukushima, you know, and in fact nobody did, thanks to the meltdown, but they did because of the tsunami. And I was told it was actually Greenpeace, you know, paraphernalia that said lots of deaths were covered up. It was very scary messaging and very convincing messaging, because it's people that you care about, who you work with, and who also profess to care about the planet. So I didn't question it for a long time. I went to anti-nuclear protests, and I wrote articles about it, you know, that were also misleading, but I had also been misled, and I truly believe that a lot of the people that were misleading me had themselves been misled. And a lot of that goes right back to the Cold War, people growing up with a fear of nuclear weapons, and just in their heads they just became the same thing. Like, they never questioned it. And I didn't question it for a while. You know, I was active in the Green Party, which I'm not anymore, but again, they have very anti-nuclear policies. You hear the same lies again and again, you just believe them. And then a turning point came, which was, it was actually a friend of mine who's an engineer, who kind of noticed that I was, you know, saying some things that he didn't agree with, and he'd start saying, well, have you seen any evidence about Fukushima? You know, here's some data, you know. And actually, it's not the data that really changed my mind, and the science communication, social science bears this out, but it's often the communicator themselves. So I trusted him, but I also looked at the data and went, okay, well, maybe I was wrong about Fukushima. And then some weeks later he said, well, you said this about Chernobyl, here's the data. And then I went, oh no, I was wrong about Chernobyl as well. But the interesting thing was that I went back to these groups and I said, guys, good news, it's not as scary as we thought, nuclear's not that bad. And I was just shouted at, maybe that was a bit naive, I was shouted at, and I was told, you know, who's gotten to you? Are you a shill now? And it was really horrible when that's, you know, your people that you hang out with, your tribe. So I kept my mouth shut, because I don't want to lose all of my peer group. And I didn't mention it, but I had changed my mind. My friend had slowly chipped away. And, you know, he probably thought in the beginning that he wouldn't change my mind because I was so against nuclear, but actually, you know, it takes time for people to change their mind, and he was very patient with me, and he answered my questions. And then I went away and I wrote a book, and it was a book about how to live with a low carbon footprint, which I don't promote anymore, but I used to promote. It's another thing when you're in these environmental movements, you promote living with less, which I don't agree with this anymore. Actually, I believe now in energy abundance, that everybody should just have cheap, clean energy, and what's wrong with that? So long as it's not doing any damage. You know, yes, everything has a little bit of a cost, but actually there's a cost to humans too of not having abundant energy, and we're experiencing that in Europe at the moment with an energy crisis, but I'll get to that in a minute. So I wrote this book, and I had a chapter in there on vaccines, and then I was attacked again, lots of anti-vaxxers who are, you know, again, this tends to be kind of green movements. Why are you writing that? Who are you shilling for? And I completely stepped away. I just, you know, I'm fed up. I'm trying to do some science communication here. I'm gonna step away from these groups. And I did for a couple of years, but I was kind of homeless because I still wanted to make change in the world, but I was starting to feel completely lost. And then Extinction got in touch with me. It was founded in the UK. I don't know how big it was here, but it was huge across Europe. Really big movement, and America as well. And they said, we've seen you do talks, will you come and be a spokesperson for us? And I said, well, I have some views you might not agree with. And they said, that's fine, you know, we only talk about these things, climate change, you know, You don't really talk about the solution side so much. So I said, that sounds okay to me, and they gave me some big speaking slots, and I felt like, okay, I'm doing a good job, because if I wasn't doing this, they might have someone else doing it who might be anti-nuclear. But then the turning point came, so I did that for 2 years, and I was one of their main spokespeople. And then I got offered a slot on the Andrew Neil show. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. It's a very, very big show in the UK. Andrew Neil is a very forensic interviewer. And I went in confident because, by now I'd been back to university and done a master's in science communication. I'd changed my mind on nuclear. I felt like I've got the evidence on climate change, I'm going to go in. And then he asked me very directly, what are we going to do to replace gas? Extinction Rebellion says we need to cut out all the gas. What are we going to do to replace it? And I wanted to say nuclear energy, and I couldn't because I was there as a spokesperson for this group. And you pressed me, wouldn't let me not answer the question. And so I said, I'm not here to offer you solutions, Andrew. And this interview was viewed by millions of people, and that clip was put online, and it had 2 million views on Twitter alone overnight. I had to turn off my social media. And everybody was looking at me saying, clueless environmentalist, which obviously was a little bit unfair because it wasn't true, but I put myself in that position, so I take responsibility for that. But I just thought, that's it, my career's ended, nobody's going to trust me anymore, I've made a mistake. And then the next day I had lots of journalists reaching out and said, do you want to tell your story, because we feel like there's more going on. And it was actually Telegraph that first reached out. It's a fairly right-leaning paper, but it's a very respected broadsheet, it's read by a lot of politicians. And I'd actually looked at their articles before on nuclear, and they'd never published a single fair article. It had all been quite anti. And I said, I'll give you the scoop on what happened in Extinction Rebellion if you let me write the first pro-nuclear piece on nuclear in the Telegraph. And they said yes. So I kind of fell into nuclear advocacy. It wasn't deliberate, but then obviously that was printed, and then that caused a big ruckus, and it was all over the news, not just in Britain, but just across Europe. And I started being asked to speak about nuclear. But I didn't know a lot about it, so I had to start again. What are the arguments? You'll know the typical arguments: waste, cost, build time, all of these things. And now I debate the people who are against, and I'm very, very well versed in both their arguments and the actual arguments on the other side, because I used to be on that side and now on this side. And I know that so many of them have good intentions, but they're very fear-led. They're very, fear has really crept in, and once that fear's there, it's very hard to remove. But I tend to kind of just use language that appeals to them. So when people say, what about nuclear waste? Isn't nuclear waste harming us? And I say, well, the waste has never harmed anybody, but fossil fuel waste is being stored in the Earth's atmosphere. Do you want to talk about that? And I say a lot of things like that, which are it's still quite activist messaging, but it works with those groups because they respond to that kind of messaging more than they'll respond to data, which I do also try to talk about, but not in those groups. So yeah, I've had an interesting journey, and I wouldn't say I've completely left the movement. I don't do I did close roads and things like that. I have done a lot of activism over the years. I don't do any of that anymore, but I kind of see my activism now as trying to change what the movement is and what it stands for, because I don't know how it became something where it's about living with less and personal sacrifice, because actually the data doesn't bear that out anyway. We can all sacrifice. It's going to make such a small difference on a global scale. It makes almost an insignificant difference. So you can do it, and I can do it, and we can quit all the things that people say we should quit doing, but actually it's so insignificant. From my perspective, if we care about bringing down emissions, which we should, even if you don't care about climate change, I do, but even if you don't, millions of people, something like over 8 million people die a year just from air pollution from fossil fuels. So I just feel like we've got a cleaner, technology that can power huge, immense projects that can drive humanity forward, like the Hadron Collider, right? That needed a lot of clean energy from France and Sweden to be able to push the boundaries of science. And what's really sad is that now they're having to shut it down temporarily because there's an energy crisis in Europe. So I feel like, whoa, now we're holding back humanity because we've made these decisions. And some of those decisions have come because that environmental message of live with less and don't progress has just kind of stepped in, just ordinary individuals who might not even care about the environment. So I'm now kind of challenging that messaging, both in those groups, with those groups, and to anyone really who I can speak to about these issues. Because I feel like if you want to make progress on these issues, you need to understand the roots of where they come from. And I have called out the environmental movement for kind of idolising poverty, so I have a bit more of a I have a different perspective on this. You know, these movements tend to be quite sort of well-to-do. You know, they've lived a life of energy abundance. I was at a talk in Sydney yesterday at the university there, and one of the questions that the moderator asked was, are we addicted to energy? And I said, I'm appalled by this question. You know, are you addicted to food every time you eat? Energy is life. Energy is life. We are so energy rich. You know, we need to be aware of this. We are so used to the lights working and the aircon working. There are millions of people around the world who don't have access to that, and now they want it. Ideally, we just want it to be as clean as possible, but even then I would say, if they need to burn some coal to get there, hey, we did it. We did it. And at least, you know, India and China are burning a lot of coal, but they're also looking ahead and they're building a lot of reactors. China's actually trying to build 150 reactors, which is the most ambitious program in the world. So they're already thinking ahead to when they can get off of this coal, because although it's cheap and it's helping to lift them out of poverty now, they're also seeing the impacts of the air pollution and thinking, wow, we don't really want that long term. Whereas a lot of Europe has become stagnant. We have kind of been de-industrializing. You know, I don't know how much you heard about this, but in the wake of the Fukushima Daiichi meltdown in 2011, a lot of Europe just phased out its nuclear power plants. Germany phased out 11 nuclear power plants. And, you know, you're never going to have a tsunami in Germany, right? But also, and that was led by a green government, by Merkel, who decided, she made a decision with eyes wide open to become more dependent on imports from Russia. And now, you know, the Nord Stream pipeline has been vandalized mysteriously, and all that methane is leaking out into the atmosphere. And Germany is in an absolute crisis. So Britain's struggling because we import a lot too, but Germany's in an absolute crisis. The energy prices are just, people can't afford to put the heating on this winter. They're talking about, they don't even have enough firewood to get them through the winter for people that could burn firewood to stay warm. And now there's a kind of a fight going on in the EU where some countries are saying, why should we supply our nuclear during a crisis to Germany when they shut their own? And they have 3 reactors that are still running, and just this week they finally U-turned and said, we'll stop decommissioning them, but only until the end of the year. It's really hard to shift this ideology, but what's really positive about this, I mean, I am sorry, really sorry that that's what it's come to. It's come to energy poverty and energy scarcity for people to understand that we need energy. Energy is life, and it's an incredible thing, and everybody should have access to it. And we should just build reactors everywhere, frankly, is what I think personally. But, you know, because why not? Who knows what's around the corner that will require more energy, not less, which is the traditional messaging of environmentalism. And so now in Germany, they're kind of U-turning on that, and other countries are now starting to say maybe we should have a nuclear program. Obviously, it takes some time. I'm here in Australia trying to encourage you to talk to each other. You know, I feel like in Australia it's very polarised, much more than in Britain. In Britain, the Labour Party supports nuclear. It has it in its policies. The Conservatives do, that's the party that's in charge, and the Liberal Democrats also do. They didn't used to historically, but they changed their minds and put out an official statement saying that they now do. So actually, you know, there's something in it for everyone, whether it's because you care about energy resilience and independence, which all of Europe is now talking about constantly, because now we're looking to places like France where they have a lot of reactors and they have a clean energy mix, you know, over 70% from nuclear, and we're kind of going, you know, we're dependent on them now, and they made a good decision in the 80s when they built all those reactors. So we're finally trying to build them, but it's very slow going because we have a shortage of workers, so I actually feel like Australia is in a really good place to completely surpass anything we're trying to do, because you have coal-fired power stations that you're shutting down, which have been identified as perfect spots for nuclear reactors. A lot of the infrastructure is already there that will make it cheaper. A lot of the workers are here. I don't mean just nuclear engineers, I mean welders and builders. We have a shortage. You don't have a shortage. You have a lot of those people here. And then you have a third of, you export a third of uranium, right? You're the third biggest exporter of uranium in the world. So you have huge reserves of uranium, which, you know, a lot of people are now going to be trying to buy from you because they're starting nuclear programs for the first time because we're in a crisis. Last point, we made a mistake. So let's use Germany again as an example. They made a mistake when they phased out their nuclear power stations. They chose to also phase out coal, which I understand, and I think that we should do that eventually, but don't do it until you have something to replace it, because you cannot have the renewables, which are intermittent, without a base load power. I'm sure you know this, but you'll also then know that your government is saying, we're just going to have 100% renewables, we'll close the coal and we won't need a base load power. Don't make the mistake that Germany has made, because they are now in crisis and they are struggling to get through the winter. And frankly, people are going to die because they can't warm their homes and it gets very cold there. Similar thing is happening in Britain. It's not as bad, but we are trying to build reactors as well as renewables, so we don't have that kind of 100% renewables argument that I keep hearing over here. You know, I said to someone on this debate yesterday, I debated someone who's for 100% renewables at the university, and he said, I just think we build them and then there'll be some kind of battery storage around the corner. Look, hands up, I put my hands up and say, I used to say that 20 years ago. Like, how many corners are we going to wait to turn? 20 years ago, I used to say battery storage is around the corner. It hasn't happened. The laws of physics work in the same way in Australia as they do anywhere else in the world. The battery storage is not there. It is not around the corner. You can't rely on that. You need to have a base load, a firm generation of energy. I hope it's nuclear. I hope that is what, you know, the decision that will be made here, that the ban is lifted and that you realise you actually are a nuclear nation. You know, you have ANSTO, you have uranium reserves, you have a world-leading department in science and technology, which also has a reactor, which a lot of people that I've spoken to in Australia don't know. Also a member of AUKUS, which is trying to get nuclear submarines. I don't understand why the ideology is still there around energy, but I hope that my coming here helps to shift that and at least gives you some talking points to talk to the other side, because obviously they're the ones that hold the keys now. But just remember that it's these people like me are out there, and actually we're right in our echo chamber. We just hear the same things again and again. Having those conversations is so important. And I know it's hard to have them, but it does change minds. Even if it's not right away, and you think, well, they're kind of buckling down and they're getting more resistant to the ideas. Not really. I think, you know, an idea that's come will always win out, and I actually think reason also will always win out. And when I left Extinction Rebellion, you'd be surprised at how much support I had from inside the movement, especially from younger people who said, actually, we agree with you, just we can't say it publicly. I'm hoping to sort of create a platform, create a wave of a movement where people feel that they can say it, and you need people here in the Labour Party to say it, because, you know, they're so dead against it, and ultimately it's not about left versus right politics. Like I said, in the UK it's not as split an issue. Ultimately it's about the future of Australia, and I would hate to come back in 10 years and say, I told you not to do what Germany did. Why did it take a crisis to realise that energy is life? Thank you for listening to me.
Thanks very much, Zion. Just before I introduce the next speaker, a tidbit of information. France has got 70% or thereabouts nuclear energy. Would you believe that Ukraine, I think, comes in second with about 50%? So it shows you how widespread in Europe it was. That's partly because they were part of the USSR, which someone keeps reminding us of. But an interesting fact, Ukraine's well ahead of Australia. So our next guest speaker, less well known, but I'm sure that he's going to make up for that in the next little while. Stephen Wilson. I don't know why I didn't meet him earlier. He's written the book on how we could get nuclear operating in Australia in the next 10 years, and I think that's an appropriate step to take after we've heard from Zion. So, Stephen, over to you.
Thanks, Graham, for the kind introduction and for the warm welcome and the invitation to speak today. It's a hard act to follow. From closing roads to opening minds, it's a wonderful transformation. Zion, I think, has made the case and is making the case for why we need nuclear energy in Australia and around the world. The research that my team was asked to do at UQ was asked a different question, which was what would be required? And I think everyone's got access to a copy of the report. Feel free to pick one up, and if you need more copies to distribute, we've had quite a few printed, so just let me know. So the question we were asked, which became the title, was what would be required for nuclear energy plants to be operating in Australia from the 2030s? It's a very clever question. And as we did the work, I realised more and more how clever and how smart that question was. But before I come to our research findings and the recommendations, I just want to start with an observation, which I think follows on from what Zion has said just now. It seems to me that the anti-nuclear movement in Australia is afraid of several things. I think the first is there's a fear of nuclear energy in general. And I know the feeling because I used to be afraid of nuclear energy, but I'm not anymore. And you know, there's a saying about this that that knowledge dispels fear. I want to just say that. Sorry, I just want to just jump to this. That if we don't have nuclear power in the system, this was the theme of my keynote at the ANA conference. That it'll be close to impossible to decarbonise the economy. I think it's a really important message that we need to get out there. But while that's true, we can't just assume that nuclear power in Australia is inevitable as a result of that statement of fact. So there's a lot of work to be done, and this work is sort of an early first step towards that. So, you know, fear. There's been a lot of talk about fear. And I just want to touch on that it's an important thing and we need to overcome it. It always springs from ignorance, and I think that came through in Zion's comments. But knowledge dispels fear. So this is very important work to have these conversations and to talk with people. If you suffer from a fear of flying, there are really effective courses you can do to help you overcome that fear of flying. Maybe we need some courses for people that are afraid of nuclear, maybe members of parliament and others. The second fear that I want to talk about is what they like to call nuclear waste, which is actually spent fuel, or more accurately, fuel that has been used the first time. It can be managed and stored and reprocessed for use again in the future. And I think we should talk about the prudent stewardship of used fuel. But I think more than those two fears, the fear of nuclear in general and the fear of waste, is there's actually a huge fear of admitting to being anti-nuclear now. Anti-nuclear people are so terrified of admitting it, admitting that they're closed-minded, they'll do almost anything to avoid being identified as such. So that became quite clear to me in the three parliamentary inquiries that I attended. I gave evidence at all three of them. And I realised people were not giving an explicit, outright anti-nuclear message. They were giving other messages. Now, in the old days, in the 70s and 80s during the Cold War, there was the big warning. So there was waste, there was accidents, there was radiation, and nuclear proliferation. They were the big four. But I've noticed now it's changed. So they talk about costs. Oh, yeah, nuclear's fine, but it's too expensive. And then they'll say, oh, yeah, it's fine, but it takes too long. You know, by the time we build these things, it'll be too late, so we can't worry about that. And if you have a counter to those two arguments, then they'll come again to the waste story. Same in the UK, yeah. Now, I just wanted to, Zion has mentioned Chernobyl. This was an obit from the Australian recently. These three guys here, the four guys who got sent to the salt lines, they were not told that there was a fatal flaw in the design of the reactor, and that's why that was the ultimate cause of that accident. But the interesting thing is all three of these guys who were very close to that enormous disastrous accident, and Anatoly Dyatlov got around 600 rem of exposure. All these guys lived to a relatively senior age, despite the fact they got sent to Siberia for 10 years to work in the labour camps as well, on top of the radiation exposure. So I think we should keep that in mind when people talk about the fear. So the waste narrative is quite important. What we've been told, and I was told this and I believed this until very recently, we've been told this is an enormous, expensive, unsolved problem. The actual truth is it's a small, inexpensive problem that has been solved. And I think it's very important that we communicate that as part of our sharing of people. So the tactics, so these are the tactics that people use, and that's the background. So none of these things were brought out in this report, because the report is focused on a different question, which is what would we have to do if we were to have nuclear plants in Australia. Our main finding in this report is we can do this. And that actually surprised me. When I sat down to start this work, I thought it's too complicated, it's too difficult, it's too high tech, we're too small a country, we can't really do this. What I came to realise is we can actually do this if we put our minds to it. And our main recommendation is we must prepare the real options. We may need them. So a real option it's an option because it may or may not be deployed, we don't know. But if we don't prepare it, then we can be certain that we won't be able to deploy it. We've got to do the homework, the preparation work, and that takes time and organisation and commitment. So this brings us to the next pernicious message that's being put about, which is we don't need nuclear. And Zion again has touched on this. You know, we don't need nuclear because we've got this endless infinite supply of low-cost wind and solar. And such is the imprudent advice coming from people who should know better, people in positions of public influence. They're making the case that we don't prepare. They're saying, no, we should not prepare the option to deploy nuclear energy. Now, this is the height of national foolishness, and we shouldn't be afraid to call people out on giving this kind of really deeply foolish advice. Now, think about the balance of risk. When I weigh up the evidence, the scales, when I look at the power system, can we run a power system just on wind, solar, and some batteries and pumped hydro? The evidence that I see is tilted very, very strongly to the outcome that if we put all our energy eggs in the basket of wind and sunshine and water, we'll end up with a disaster. Technically, economically, politically, socially, environmentally, and probably legally as well. So that's why we need to create the real options to deploy energy. There's no point we get to 2030 or 2035 and we say, oh, if only we'd started working on this in 2022. You know, that would be the most ridiculous position to put ourselves in. A hypothetical option is worthless. An academic option has no value. An imaginary option is useless. We need real options. Creating real options has very low costs and their practical value is extremely high. Now, at the moment, all we've got is what I call scenario A. Okay, so these so-called scenarios published by AEMO, they're not really scenarios, they're just little variations on scenario A. So I want you to ask yourself, where should the burden of proof be with respect to this question? And I think that for any critical infrastructure, energy clearly, water, food, for any critical infrastructure, the burden of proof must rest on the shoulders of those who want to fiddle with known engineering principles and practice. Now, whether the scenarios that AEMO publishes pass the technical feasibility hurdle, I think is actually doubtful. The economic viability test, I think, is in question. And I think the political acceptability of those so-called scenarios is far from certain. So they're just some of the basic requirements before you can call something a scenario. We need to do the prudent preparation through the 2020s so that we can deploy nuclear in the 2030s. Now, these real options that I'm talking about, what do they mean? Well, collectively, if you're creating an option to put a nuclear power plant on old coal plant sites, for example, some in New South Wales, some in Victoria, some in Queensland, collectively, that gives you what I call Plan B. That collection of real options is our Plan B, and preparing that is prudent. Now, you can see in our report here that the way we organised our answer to the question was under these 8 topic headings, and each one of these topics became a chapter. There's another theme that's didn't have its own chapter, but it's woven throughout the whole report, and that's the theme of risk management that actually is related to all of those topics. If you only read one page of the report, read the foreword by Chancellor Peter Varghese. Excellent overview of the way we need to be thinking about this problem. If you've got another couple of minutes, read the one-page summary. If you've got 10 minutes, read the two-page conclusions. Each of the 8 chapters is exactly 4 pages long. It's written to be like a sort of little 4-page leaflet. So if you're just interested in technology, read that one. Or if you're just interested in economics, read that one. But you don't have to read it from beginning to end. Okay, so let's talk about these topics. First, I should acknowledge that the team behind this, so there are a team of student researchers whose names are there. The sponsor of the study, Barry Murphy, wonderful man, former CEO of Caltex Asia Pacific, privatised the airports, ran the Rail Track Corporation. We had some postgrad mentors as well, and a number of industry experts. These are all Australians or people who are in Australia who have expertise on the range of topics that we're talking about in the report. So I'll just touch very lightly on each of these topics. So first, starting with the context. This is what our system in Australia looks like at the moment. You'll find this in Figure 1 of the report. The dark colours at the bottom are the coal plants, the brown coal and the black coal plants. And then sitting on top of that, we've got some gas. The sort of greenish colour here is the hydro. Much of it in Snowy, but there's some other hydro as well, including here in Queensland. And then we've got gas turbines and then the renewables sitting on top. Now, if we roll that forward, this is taking into account the planned retirement dates of the coal-fired fleet as it was at our date of publication. This is recently, there's been some updates, and this will actually be declining more steeply according to current announcements. And then I've left, and then the gas retirements you see here, and then the hydro has very long asset life. But the first interesting thing to note is that the wind and solar will all be gone by 2050. Basically, the entire system, except for the big hydro assets, will all be gone by 2050. We need to completely rebuild the generation fleet in any case, unless we were going to do life extensions of coal plants. So the other thing is that the wind and the solar are put on the top because they can't be guaranteed. There's no firm capacity there. And you can see that the minimum demand level is about 15,000 megawatts. The average load is about 22,000. This is for the whole of the eastern states grid. And the peak, depending on how hot the summer is either sort of 30 to 35 gigawatts. So the big question is, what is going to replace that coal fleet, those 16 coal plants, when they retire? That's the number one question. I've been talking about this since at least 2016 at the engineers conference. You know, this fleet is falling off a cliff, and we need a plan for what's going to replace it. This stuff up here cannot do the job of these machines here. It's not a substitute. We need something to replace this. And what you find when you do the analysis and think about it is this is ideal for nuclear power plants. So what we decided to do in this study was to use a concrete example to take one particular type of design that would be suitable in the Australian context and look at that in detail. We're not advocating that this particular design be chosen, but we just wanted to have a concrete example. And so the one that we chose is the most mature of the small modular reactor plants and designs. This has achieved its US license from the toughest regulator in the world, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And this is based on a new approach to nuclear. Instead of building larger and larger, gigantic reactors on a 1,000 megawatt or gigawatt scale, you build a number of small units of much smaller size. And then this is the module here. You can see a person down the bottom here, and about as long as a cricket pitch, standing vertically on end is the size of that. Another way to think of it is about like a Boeing 737, similar costs, similar sort of approximate size. And then you put 4 or 6 or 12 of these in a pool and in the main reactor plant building, and then you have something getting close to 1,000 megawatts, but from these 12 individual units. So how would you roll out this kind of technology in Australia? Well, you take the same classic approach that we take with any sort of large asset deployment. we follow the discipline of the engineering project lifecycle. We've already done the preliminary concept study, that's in your hand, then a full scoping study, and you work your way up through pre-feasibility. So the scoping study will step back and look at all the range of designs and suitable site types and narrow those down to a short list. The pre-feasibility study will look at that short list and then focus on which one is most suitable. And then the feasibility study for that one design that's been selected for that particular site will do all the work, all the technical work and the approvals and the environmental impact statements and so forth. To get that to the point, you're ready to sit down with the bankers and talk about financing, put the debt and equity financing together, and then build the project, do the commissioning, and then put that into operation. Obviously, the length of these bars is not to scale. So to get to this point here of actually putting electrons on the grid, we think that's sort of minimum of 10 years, 10 to 15 years, 20 max, but we should be aiming to do that in 10 years or less, get it to commissioning. And then you've got an asset that's good for 60 years and possibly longer. So that's the disciplined approach on the engineering project management. Next big topic is governance. It is very important to remove the nuclear bans, and we talk about that in the report. There's the federal ban, there's one in Victoria from 1983, one in New South Wales from 86, there's one in Queensland that came in as a knee-jerk reaction to John Howard's Switkowski Review 2007. Those laws do need to be repealed. We can do some of that early work that I talked about before the repeal, and we should get on and do that. It just needs, all it needs is some funding. At the other extreme, we must avoid the naive idea that we just repeal the bans and then we'll magically see reactors popping up. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. This is the whole work stream. We've got part of the architecture and structure in place already, but we need to strengthen it and enhance it. It was designed for one research reactor at Lucas Heights. We need a more comprehensive framework. There's lots of help we can draw on internationally from the IAEA in this process. And we have the world's best nuclear lawyer here in Sydney, which is Helen Cook, who was one of our mentors on this work. Next big topic is capabilities. We do need to be training people, engineers, all the way from engineers through to tradespeople. Enrolments are accelerating now in our nuclear programs because of the submarine program. That's great news. That will need to be further extended and enhanced. But with the appropriate planning, we do have time to do this. We shouldn't worry that we can't do this. We already have a number of companies in Australia that have, through their parents and their parents' company structures and so forth, have involvement in the nuclear sector. As Zion said, we already are a nuclear country. We just need to leverage and build on that. The topic that I forgot at the start of the report and added in partway through is this one, this topic on society, which in many ways is the most important chapter in the whole book, and that's why we put it right in the middle of the report. We need to, the support of the society needs to be broad enough and deep enough that it will last through multiple parliaments. It can't be something that comes and goes, that flip-flops. It needs to be deep and stable and last through multiple federal parliaments and multiple state parliaments. And so engagement and the conversations that we're talking about today is a part of that. Leadership is needed at all levels of society. It's needed in academia, it's needed in business, it's needed in government, in civil society. But I think when we think about the topics that you need for a safety critical industry, we shouldn't think that this is something new. And I want to draw an analogy here with another safety critical industry, and that's air travel. Okay, we sit on aeroplanes all the time. We've got, the technology, we trust in the technology. The vendors, we know who they are, Airbus and Boeing, Embraer. The siting and the installation and the commissioning of airports, we put the airports in a safe place. The people in this industry are people that are well trained and that we trust. And behind all that is laws and institutions and governance. And all those things a comment to the nuclear industry. And I'm going to say to you today that the airline industry, we know it's a very safe industry. We know Qantas is arguably the world's safest commercial airline. I'm going to tell you today that the airline industry is a far, far, far more dangerous industry than the nuclear industry. People usually say it the other way around. They say nuclear is safer than it. But this is just a fact. Go and look at the numbers and you'll come to the same conclusion. We should have confidence in ourselves as Australians to be able to do things properly and do them well. Siting, the plants need to be put somewhere. The interesting thing about small modular reactors is that the flexibility in siting is so much greater than for large plants. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US has approved the application to say that the emergency planning zone around a new-scale small modular reactor is at the plant fence. It's not a 10-mile exclusion zone in the case of an accident. That's the plant boundary. It's about 1 square kilometre. So if you're wondering what does 1 square kilometre look like, well, a circle of 1 square kilometre is that size. This is the University of Queensland, which some of you might have attended. And you can see this is the Great Court here. Now, I'm not proposing that we put a small modular reactor plant in the middle of the Great Court. The reason I'm showing, when I'm in Canberra, I use Parliament House. Because the folks there can get the size. So this is the swimming pool where the reactors go. This is 18 Olympic swimming pools. Okay, you can see the UQ swimming pool here, right? 50-metre long Olympic swimming pool. It's about twice as long, and stack those pools 9 deep. Okay, it's a big pool of water. That's part of the safety, defence, and depth of that particular design. But your site boundary is about that size, so you actually don't need a huge amount of land. Sort of the scale of a sports field, Kalinga Park, Shore Park sort of scale is what we're talking about. Economics. They tell us it's too expensive. They're wrong. There's a paradox here, and we need to get someone in the office of the Prime Minister to explain this to him. He thinks that if you take wind or solar at $50 a megawatt hour levelized cost, and I'm giving you another choice of nuclear at, let's say, $100 a megawatt hour, he thinks the path to the cheapest system is to build this cheap $50 stuff, and you'll get the cheapest electricity system. It's wrong. You would think, if you're a lawyer or maybe an accountant or something, you might think, oh, you just build the cheap stuff, right? But the problem is it's cheap, yes, but it's also nasty, in the sense that it doesn't do the whole job and it'll end up giving you a much, much more expensive system. So paradoxically, if you put in the right amount of the $100 nuclear, you will get the lowest cost system, and that needs to be explained. These small modular reactors are very flexible, so they can be accommodated in the system in a way that was perhaps not as easy for the large plants that weren't built with flexibility in mind. The reason NuScale designed their plant this way is because they had engagements with future customers and they said, what do you need? And they said, hey, we've got wind farms, coal plants, we can't build new coal plants. Can you make a nuclear plant dance and play nicely with the wind farms? Okay, yeah, we can do that. And they designed it accordingly. So at the system level, the economics makes fantastic sense. What about the financing? There will definitely be a role for government in the financing, and we lay out in the report an example, a sort of illustrative worked example of what a financial structure might look like. The role for private banks, the role for equity for private banks and for government in the financial structure. The numbers I want you to look at here, I called this levelized, long run average cost of energy instead of LCOE. I just want to draw people's minds away from LCOE. Long run average cost of energy. If you're going to write a 30-year offtake contract, and someone will need to write 30-year offtake contracts to make these assets bankable, what price would you need to put in that 30-year offtake contract so that a plant like this could wash its face? Well, there's a range of estimates here. So if the first plant was going to be assumed to be quite expensive, you might need to write $100 a megawatt hour cost in that contract. By the time you've built 2, 3, 4, 5 of them, you're getting good at it, the cost is coming down, the time frame's coming down, I think you're looking at about $76 a megawatt hour, Australian dollars a megawatt hour. If you're buying the electricity at that price on under a 30-year contract, this becomes an investable asset. And the nth of a kind in the long run, I think we could be targeting $60 a megawatt hour. These are very interesting numbers. The other thing in the structure here is that a lot of that is recovery of fixed capital cost. So you might sell a guarantee to someone for, say, $50. I'll guarantee you access to electricity whenever you want for $50, and then when you do want it, when you do call that contract and you actually consume energy from that capacity, pay the extra $22 or $26 for carbon-free, reliable electricity. In other words, you guarantee that you'll pay the fixed cost of the capacity, and then you just pay the variable cost when you use it. So these economics are actually very interesting. But we do need to think again about the dynamics of the market. So looking forward, where are we going with this? I think the AUKUS announcement has definitely stimulated the debate. I don't think there's any stopping the debate now. We've had 3 parliamentary inquiries. Before that, we had Switkowski and Kevin Scares. What we need to do now is we need to get on with the work. We need to do the scoping study. This needs to be funded, and the education and engagement. And then we build up from the sort of early stages of, oh, there's an opportunity here, popularisation and challenge, that's the conversation and the debate. And then when we come out of that, we put the governance structures in place, change the laws, and then this just becomes a normal part of everyday life. We're all saying, of course, we should have had nuclear power plants all along. That's what I had for you today, and I'd be pleased to answer questions.